I hope you don't have to pee, because you have another guest on your show. We have an added bonus, a very special guest who has been truly on the front lines working to protect LGBTs from discrimination. And when I say front lines, I mean it. The United States Supreme Court system. Perhaps you've heard of it. Our next guest... Did you notice the water features in front of the ballroom this year? They're brand new. They're watering eyeballs. They're called Kavanaugh's eyes. Take all the time you need. Our next guest is a senior attorney with Lambda Legal, the oldest and largest national legal organization committed to achieving full recognition of the civil rights of lesbians, gay men, bisexual, transgender people, and individuals living with HIV. He played an active part in securing the freedom to marry for our same-sex couples and their families across the United States as a member of the legal team in the landmark U.S. Supreme Court case Obergefell versus Hodges. As lead counsel, he also obtained the first court decision in the country holding that the Federal Housing Act sex discrimination prohibition covers discrimination against LGBT people in Smith versus Avanti. He's here to share the current status of LGBT fair housing. Please welcome Omar Gonzalez-Pagan.
Hey, Omar.
Hey, David.
How are you?
How are you?
Have a seat in the hot seat. Oh. I'm not going to curse like John, because Jeff will get mad. But I dropped this shit. I wanted to be a lawyer all the way back in the day. Thought about it, and I talked to Omar and said, oh my God, I'm glad I didn't have to do this. Let's talk about the case that Nick Cordelai just talked about.
Sure, Marcia Wetzel.
You did it, right? You were part of the team?
I wasn't on Marcia's case. Actually, my colleague, Karen Lowy, who's our senior strategist, led that case. And she's been doing LGBT seniors work for a long time. And she and I brought the first case, Smith v. Avanti, under the Fair Housing Act. And that case was possible for a couple of reasons. First, already establishing a framework that the current laws in the federal books that prohibit sex discrimination prohibit every single person in this room, right? If you're gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, you are protected under the law from employment discrimination, from housing discrimination, healthcare, education, and the like. And bringing these cases and making sure that the courts correctly interpret existing law is part of what we've been doing over the last couple of decades to great success. And in April 2017, we had two twin victories. We had the Smith v. Avanti case in Colorado, and you see here a picture of Tanya and Rachel and their two kids, in which a court found that the Fair Housing Act covers discrimination based on transgender status and sexual orientation. And here you have a lesbian couple, one of whom is transgender, who was denied the opportunity to rent a home in Gold Hill, Colorado, because of their, in writing on an email, unique relationship and their uniqueness. And we sued. And we ultimately got that first victory in the context of housing. That same month, actually that same week, in Chicago, we won a case for Kim Hively, a woman from Indiana, that established that sexual orientation discrimination was a form of sex discrimination under the Title VII, the employment prohibition. That was the same court that then found for Marcia Wetzel just a couple of weeks ago. And it was that precedent that allowed that case to proceed and then established an even more applicable precedent to every single person who rents a home, which is that tenant-on-tenant harassment is prohibited by law, and that landlords, if they know about it, are responsible. And so that is something that is now a precedent that was brought, as Nick said, because of partnerships that we have done and cross work with multiple organizations, and seeing how the work even in the LGBT specific world has huge implications for the lives and rights of every single person in this country.
So how does a case like this get to a court?
Well, both cases came to us because of our help desk, both Marcia's and the Smith families. They called us, and we get approximately 6,000 calls a year. And we don't get to bring 6,000 cases. We're only like 20 attorneys at Lambda Legal.
And how do they know, like, how would a regular family person know that Lambda Legal is out there to help?
Check out lambdalegal.org. There's a link right there to contact us. There's a phone for you to contact us. And frankly, word of mouth. And trust that you build with the community, knowing that you will be the lawyers. You know, this year, one of the slogans we've been using on Pride, parades, and the like is, we are your lawyers. And I think that's the communication that a message that we want to send to the community, that we are going to be representing them, protecting their rights, and making sure that we expand those rights, including the application of federal existing civil rights laws in the housing context.
Let's talk about Jim's case. You were not specifically on the Jim Obergefell case because very few of us know that there were several cases orbiting at the same time, including a second one in Ohio, and you were on the Puerto Rico case. But the whole thing came to a win for our friend Jim, and I think we all remember that amazing moment of him talking to the president outside the Supreme Court with CNN right there in the microphone, and Jim has gone on to, he's now the Godfather, right? He is the Martin Luther King, and just a wonderful, wonderful man. Where were you when you found out that he had won?
Yeah, so it was a huge team that worked on Jim's case. We were part of the other...
Some of your colleagues, right?
Yeah, my colleagues at the ACLU, law firms, local practitioners in Ohio, and you know, we had like, I want to say like 20 people on that brief to the Supreme Court that were just the attorneys. And we were working on the side of the birth certificate cases in Ohio. Jim's was the death certificate case. They were parallel, moving together, and then they all got joined. And I was in my office. I recall it was 10 a.m., and the decisions were coming from the Supreme Court, and I had my tweet deck set up. I had SCOTUS blog open. I had my phone, different lists that I was following to see what people would say, because the Supreme Court has not advanced with technology, as some of our presenters were talking about. And so you have what's called the race of the interns. News organizations send interns into the Supreme Court, and they run. And there's a famous picture of this. They run out of the courtroom with a copy of the decision for the reporters to be able to report on it live. It was then that I got the decision, and I was in my office in New York reading it, and all of us tearing up with joy at the amazing victory that we got in that case.
So I love this story because here's a lawyer we could watch on CNN, find out same-sex marriage is now legal in America, and what's he doing? Reading the legal brief.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, you need to know what alternative universe was coming on down the pike from Scalia and Alito and Roberts. You know, some of my colleagues were in the room that day when the Chief Justice turned to them and said, "You may celebrate this victory, but it has nothing to do with the Constitution." And he speaks to the importance of the courts and the legal system that we have, that there are existing recognition of our rights, our humanity, our dignity, that nobody can take away. And no matter how hard a fight becomes, and these days the fight is quite hard, there's a basic humanity to every single person that must be recognized. Ultimately, that is what every single one of these cases is about, whether it's marriage equality, fair housing, employment, the military trans ban, all of these cases that we're litigating, they come down to a basic recognition that we are all worth the same as human beings, that we all should have the same opportunity to prosper and live in our society as equal members. That includes the ability to rent a home. That includes the ability to marry. That includes the ability to serve your country. And ultimately, that is what we're fighting for.
And that day, back 3 years ago in June, celebration, champagne. In the law office.
Champagne in the
Can
conference
you
room after I
imagine
was
how many
done reading.
lawyers are in that room, the office?
Lawyers? There were only like 4 of us.
Okay, and then
We have 6 offices around the country, and like I mentioned, we're only like 20 plus lawyers in the
That's
country.
it?
Yeah, for Lambda Legal. And so we work a lot with law firms, partnering and trying to amplify our resources. So that day, there were like 4 of us in New York, and after I was done reading, I closed my office, huge do not disturb sign. And then we all celebrate, everybody's already celebrating outside, and then we headed down to Stonewall and actually be able to speak on stage and that day, and some of our plaintiffs were there, and actually see an incredible outpouring of community for a truly historic day and moment. And we all know that White House put on rainbow lights that day as well. And it is actually a reminder of, no matter what happens with the Supreme Court moving forward, no matter whether a certain individual gets confirmed or not, our fight is not over. We've known struggles as a community. The 80s were no easy times, and the early aughts, we had to battle marriage amendment after marriage amendment in every single state, and we have seen our community be tested, and what we have actually witnessed is the resiliency of LGBT people. And I think these cases that day attest to the celebration of that resiliency, a celebration of that struggle, and a celebration of the prospect of a better future.
And in this case, Smith versus Avanti, it was a psychic, right? That was her job, who wrote an email
That is
saying
true.
you can't live here.
So Miss Avanti was a proprietor of the property, the owner of the property, and the landlord. She also had a side business as a psychic, and so our favorite headline, I think, in my entire time at Lambda Legal was "Psychic Landlord Didn't See the Lawsuit Coming." But ultimately, this case, and I want to ultimately say that we got this precedent set, and ultimately the case settled, and Ms. Avanti was cooperative with the Senate with the settlement, and actually instituted affirmative policies that are good moving forward, and the like. And I think it speaks to the fact that ultimately, when we want to talk about the status of LGBT for housing discrimination is one of the underreported forms of discrimination in this country. Basic levels. Just the other day, I want to say 2 days ago actually, Freddie Mac announced the results of a study they commissioned back in April, a survey of over 2,300 LGBT people. And I recall John Painton talking about the statistics about millennials and homeownership and going up to 63% by X year. What we need to talk about also is the reality that homeownership in the LGBT community is 16% less than in the general population. Part of that, so it's 64%, just over 64% for the general population, 49% for the LGBT community. Part of that has to do with the fact that there is fear, a reasonable, understandable fear that you will be discriminated against in finding a home, whether renting or owning. And That is what the Avantis experienced. 47% of LGBT people expressed that fear in this study.
And this first win for fair housing, do you think it's going to snowball and keep going?
Absolutely. Our purpose in bringing this specific case was the following. One, get a precedent out there that actually says that the Fair Housing Act protects LGBT people, but also use it as a communication tool for the community. You are protected. And now we're seeing other cases that we're winning. Marshall Wetzel's case. There's a new case that just got brought in Missouri, another elderly couple that was discriminated against a lesbian couple because they wouldn't let them live in a room together at a community living facility. Lo and behold, one of them was actually a teacher of Andy Cohen from Bravo, so it's gotten some media attention because of that as well. But we're now seeing these cases being brought forward. Look, having explicit protections is so important. And that's why several states, 20 states, have housing protections that are in place that are explicit. That is why we support the Equality Act, and we're so glad that we heard today about that support from the industry that's being announced today. Because having those explicit protections is important to communicate to the community that you're protected. But in the meantime, right, while we get there, while we get that in place, it is important for the community to know that they have tools and protections in place already. The Fair Housing Act prohibits sex discrimination, and that protects LGBT people, because when you think about sexual orientation or somebody's transgender status, you inherently think about their sex. And that is ultimately what we're trying to tell the community. You're all protected. And we, I think, as a market, and so thankful to be here today, you know, there's a role to be played of telling your sellers, your buyers, your renters, your owners that discrimination is illegal, is prohibited under state and federal law in some places and under federal law everywhere. And I think thank you for being part of that.
And as we close, I think we all understand that not everybody wants to get into the advocacy game, but it's also not often that we get the opportunity to meet with us two people that are really on the legitimate front lines, Nicordelai and Omar, protecting all of us in every day of our lives. So thank you, Omar. Thank you, the doctor. Great job.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Omar. Thank you, Dr. Cordelai.